Something unusual happened in North American geopolitics this week, not because of a treaty, not because of a military move, but because of a sentence that sounded casual, almost dismissive. Donald Trump looked at the situation and said he does not need Canada, just as Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney was heading toward China. At first glance, it sounds like political bravado. But in geopolitics, timing is never accidental. Welcome to the Strategic Geopolitics Brief, where we don't react to headlines, we decode what they really mean. Let's slow this moment down. When Donald Trump says he doesn't need Canada, he's not talking emotionally, he's talking strategically. Canada is America's largest trading partner, deeply embedded in U.S. supply chains, energy security, automotive manufacturing, and critical minerals. So saying you don't need Canada is not a factual statement. It's a pressure statement. And pressure only makes sense when it's aimed at someone who has other options. That's where Mark Carney and China enter the picture. Carney's visit to China isn't about friendship, it's about leverage. Canada finds itself in an uncomfortable position, economically tied to the United States, but increasingly uncertain about Washington's long-term reliability. Trade disputes, tariff threats, industrial nationalism, and America First policies have forced Ottawa to quietly explore alternatives, and Beijing is one of the few markets large enough to matter. Trump understands this perfectly, so when he dismisses Canada at the exact moment its leader engages China, the message isn't meant for Ottawa alone, it's meant for Beijing. The message is simple. Don't mistake Canada's outreach for independence. The U.S. still controls the center of gravity. But here's the strategic risk. By publicly downplaying Canada's importance, Trump accelerates the very behavior he claims to dismiss. Allies don't respond to being minimized by becoming more loyal. They respond by diversifying. Canada's outreach to China is not a pivot away from the U.S. It's insurance. And insurance exists only when trust erodes. For China, this moment is an opportunity, not to replace the U.S. as Canada's primary partner, but to insert itself into cracks inside the Western alliance structure. Beijing doesn't need exclusivity. It needs relevance. And that's why this moment matters. This isn't about trade numbers. This isn't about personalities. This is about a shifting alliance psychology. Trump is signaling dominance. Canada is signaling hedging. China is watching and waiting. The real question isn't whether the U.S. needs Canada. The real question is how many times you can tell an ally they don't matter before they start acting like it. And that's where geopolitics quietly changes direction, not with wars, but with words. And to understand where this is heading, we need to zoom out, beyond the personalities, beyond the sound bites, and look at the structural pressures underneath. Canada's economy is not just connected to the United States, it is interlocked with it. Energy flows south. Auto parts cross the border multiple times before a single car is assembled. Defense cooperation runs so deep that much of it is invisible. In theory, this makes Canada indispensable. But in practice, interdependence can be weaponized. Trump's political worldview treats dependence as leverage, not partnership. When he says the U.S. doesn't need Canada, he's testing how far economic gravity alone can keep allies in line. The assumption is simple. Geography will do the work. Canada has nowhere else to go. That assumption is increasingly dangerous because while Canada cannot replace the U.S., it can reduce vulnerability selectively, quietly, and strategically. Critical minerals agreements, financial cooperation, green technology supply chains, and alternative export markets don't need to replace American ties to weaken American pressure. They only need talk to dilute it. And that's where China comes in. Beijing doesn't see Canada as a prize. It sees it as a pressure point inside the Western system, Every trade discussion, every investment dialogue, every diplomatic visit signals one thing to Washington: the alliance network is no longer frictionless. China's strategy here is patient. It doesn't challenge the U.S. directly in North America. It waits for allies to feel uncomfortable enough to knock on its door themselves. And Trump's rhetoric accelerates that discomfort. This is the paradox of coercive diplomacy. The harder you squeeze, the more creative others become. Public dismissal may rally domestic audiences, but it erodes private confidence among allies. And alliances don't collapse loudly. They thin out quietly until coordination becomes harder and trust becomes conditional. There's also a domestic layer to this. Trump's comments are not aimed solely at foreign capitals. They are aimed inward, at voters who respond to the idea that America is self-sufficient, dominant, and unburdened by alliances. Canada becomes symbolic, not strategic, a stand-in for the broader argument that the U.S. gives more than it gets. But geopolitics doesn't run on symbolism for long. The more Washington frames relationships as optional, the more allies treat Washington as unpredictable. And unpredictability forces planning, not alignment. This moment also sends ripples through Europe and Asia. Other U.S. partners are watching closely, not because Canada is unique, but because Canada is safe. If even a close, stable, culturally aligned neighbor can be dismissed publicly, then no alliance is immune. That changes calculations. It encourages hedging behavior. It encourages regional self-reliance. And it quietly reduces American influence without a single confrontation. So what we're witnessing isn't a rupture, it's a recalibration. Trump is signaling strength. Canada is managing risk. China is exploiting space, and the system adjusts. History shows that major shifts rarely begin with formal breaks. They begin when allies stop assuming permanence and start planning for alternatives. That's the real signal embedded in this moment. Not that the US and Canada are drifting apart, but that certainty itself is fading. And when certainty fades in geopolitics, power doesn't disappear, it redistributes. But there's another layer beneath all of this, one that doesn't show up in press statements or official schedules. It's the supply chain layer. The modern world isn't divided only by borders anymore. It's divided by choke points, semiconductors, rare earths, energy corridors, logistics hubs. Canada sits quietly inside several of these critical systems, not loudly, not aggressively, but structurally. From critical minerals essential for electric vehicles and defense technologies to energy exports that stabilize North American markets, Canada's value is not dramatic. It's stabilizing. And stabilizers are often invisible until they're disturbed. Trump's comment disrupts that stability rhetorically, even if not immediately in policy. And rhetoric matters because it changes how planners think 5 or 10 years ahead. If you are Ottawa, you don't hear, "We don't need you," as an insult. You hear it as a risk signal. And risk signals change investment decisions. They influence where infrastructure money goes. They affect which trade agreements get prioritized. They reshape long-term industrial planning. That's why Canada's engagement with China isn't a sudden pivot. It's a slow recalibration designed to widen strategic breathing room, not to escape US gravity, but to ensure it doesn't become suffocating. And this is where the situation becomes more complex for Washington, because influence in the 21st century isn't about cutting ties. It's about being the default choice, the partner others turn to automatically, not reluctantly. Once allies begin building parallel options, influence doesn't collapse, it erodes, quietly, incrementally, irreversibly. China understands this better than anyone. Beijing doesn't need Canada to choose sides. It only needs Canada to keep the door open. Every open door is a hedge against American unpredictability. And every hedge weakens unilateral pressure. Meanwhile, Trump's approach assumes a zero-sum world, loyalty or defiance, alignment or opposition. But the current geopolitical environment doesn't work that way. It rewards ambiguity, optionality, and strategic patience. That's why this moment is so revealing. It exposes a deeper tension between two worldviews. One sees alliances as tools, useful when obedient, disposable when inconvenient. The other sees alliances as ecosystems, resilient only when partners feel secure. And ecosystems don't respond well to shock rhetoric. They adapt, they reroute, they diversify. So when Trump says the US doesn't need Canada, the strategic consequence isn't Canadian anger, it's Canadian planning. And planning is where geopolitics actually happens. No cameras, no headlines, just spreadsheets, risk models, and long-term assumptions being quietly rewritten. And here's the final uncomfortable reality. Great powers rarely lose influence because someone defeats them. They lose it because others stop depending on them. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but deliberately. This moment won't be remembered for the quote itself. It will be remembered for what it encouraged allies to do after the quote faded from the news cycle. And that's why words matter, especially when spoken casually by those who hold power. Now let's take this one level deeper into strategy timelines, not headlines. What Trump's remark really does is compress decision-making time for allies. When reassurance disappears, governments don't wait for policy changes. They anticipate them. That anticipation reshapes behavior long before any executive order or tariff is signed. For Canada, the key concern isn't today's trade volume, it's tomorrow's uncertainty. If U.S. political cycles can repeatedly threaten tariffs, tear up agreements, or publicly downgrade allies, then dependence becomes a liability. And in strategic planning, liabilities are reduced wherever possible. That doesn't mean Canada can decouple from the U.S. It means Canada will selectively rebalance. You'll see it in places that don't make headlines. Long-term mineral offtake agreements, quiet diversification of export destinations, financial and technological cooperation outside traditional North American frameworks, stronger ties with Asia on climate, batteries, AI, and infrastructure finance. None of this is dramatic, and that's precisely why it's effective. Now flip the perspective to Washington. Trump's statement assumes that economic gravity is permanent, that geography guarantees loyalty. But history shows that political trust, not geography, determines alignment. When trust weakens, proximity stops being protection and starts being exposure. And this is where the irony appears. By saying the US doesn't need Canada, Washington unintentionally signals that relationships are conditional. Once relationships become conditional, allies begin to act conditionally too. Support becomes situational. Cooperation becomes transactional. Silence replaces enthusiasm. This matters most in moments of crisis. Alliances don't fail during calm periods. They fail under stress. And when stress arrives, what matters isn't whether a treaty exists, but whether partners feel respected enough to move quickly and decisively. China is watching all of this with strategic calm. Beijing doesn't rush into replacing the United States. That would trigger resistance. Instead, it positions itself as an alternative node, a secondary option that becomes valuable only when the primary option feels unstable. That's why Canada's engagement with China doesn't have to succeed fully to succeed strategically. Even partial engagement changes Washington's leverage calculus. It tells the US that pressure has diminishing returns, and once pressure stops working reliably, power has to be exercised differently. This is the long-term cost of rhetorical dominance. Strong language creates short-term control, but long-term fragility. It trains allies to expect volatility, and volatility forces independence. We've seen this pattern before. In Europe, after repeated doubts about US commitments. In Asia, where partners hedge between Washington and Beijing in the Middle East, where security guarantees are no longer assumed, Canada is not an exception. It's simply earlier in the process. So this moment isn't about a single comment. It's about what kind of system emerges afterward. A system where allies wait for permission, or a system where allies quietly prepare for uncertainty. Trump believes strength comes from reminding others they are optional. But in geopolitics, the strongest position is being irreplaceable, not loudly declared, but silently understood. And when allies start asking themselves whether they are replaceable, the answer they reach doesn't just affect trade, it affects alignment, it affects crisis response, it affects the future architecture of power. That's the deeper shift taking place beneath this headline. Not rupture, not rebellion, but recalculation. And recalculation, once begun, rarely reverses. And there is still one more dimension that completes this picture, the credibility gap. Power in geopolitics is not only measured by GDP, military strength, or market size. It is measured by whether others believe your commitments will still matter after the next election cycle. That belief is fragile. And once shaken, it takes years, sometimes decades, to restore. Trump's statement feeds directly into that credibility question. If allies conclude that U.S. relationships are shaped more by political mood than strategic continuity, then long-term alignment becomes a gamble. And serious states don't gamble on core national interests. They hedge. Hedging doesn't look dramatic. It looks boring, technical, bureaucratic, but it is one of the most powerful forces in international politics. It means avoiding over-reliance on a single market, keeping diplomatic channels open even with rivals, designing policies that survive sudden pressure shifts, preparing for scenarios that leaders publicly deny. Canada's engagement with China fits squarely into this logic. It is not an ideological shift. It is not a betrayal. It is a risk management exercise. And that's precisely why Trump's framing is strategically counterproductive. When you tell an ally you don't need them, you may score domestic political points, but you also encourage that ally to ask a dangerous question. What happens if this relationship turns hostile? Once that question enters policy planning rooms, the dynamic changes permanently. This also exposes a deeper misunderstanding about leverage. Leverage works best when it is implied, not announced. Once it's declared openly, it becomes resistance generating. Allies don't rebel, they adjust. They don't confront, they diversify. They don't announce independence, they build it quietly. And the quiet part is what matters most, because while public attention stays fixed on rhetoric, the real movement happens underneath, in trade architecture, regulatory standards, technology partnerships, and financial corridors that shape the future balance of power. This is how influence fades in the modern era, not through collapse, not through confrontation, but through option creation. China understands this with remarkable clarity. It does not demand loyalty. It offers alternatives. And alternatives, once available, permanently weaken monopolies of influence. That doesn't mean China replaces the United States. It means the United States becomes one option among several rather than the uncontested default. And that distinction is everything. So when Trump says the US doesn't need Canada, he may believe he's asserting independence, but from a strategic perspective, he's accelerating a world where no one feels safe being dependent. And in that world, power becomes harder to concentrate, harder to command, and harder to sustain. This is how the international system shifts, not in sudden breaks, but in slow, rational recalculations made by governments that can't afford uncertainty. That's the real consequence of this moment. Not a diplomatic crisis, not a trade war, but the steady erosion of automatic alignment. And once alignment stops being automatic, geopolitics becomes far less predictable, even for the strongest player. And now we arrive at the most uncomfortable implication of all, the precedent effect. In geopolitics, allies don't only listen to what is said about them, they listen to what is said to others, because today's target often becomes tomorrow's lesson. Trump's dismissal of Canada isn't evaluated in isolation. It's processed collectively by partners across the global system. If a country as integrated, as stable, and as strategically aligned as Canada can be publicly framed as unnecessary, then the hierarchy of alliances becomes uncertain. And uncertainty forces states to rethink assumptions that once felt permanent. This is where the psychological shift happens. Alliances work best when they are boring, when cooperation is automatic, habitual, and unquestioned. The moment alliances become performative, conditional, or rhetorically disposable, they stop functioning as anchors and start functioning as variables. Variables demand contingency planning, and contingency planning is the enemy of centralized influence. This is especially relevant in a world already fractured by economic nationalism, technological decoupling, and strategic rivalry. States are no longer asking, who is our ally? They are asking, who will still be there when pressure peaks? That question now hangs over Washington more than it did a decade ago. Trump's political logic assumes strength is demonstrated by independence, by showing that America stands alone if necessary. But strategic strength has always rested on something subtler, the ability to make others feel secure enough not to seek alternatives. Security creates loyalty. Uncertainty creates options, and options dilute power. Canada's outreach to China, therefore, is not a challenge to the US. It is a symptom of a system where reassurance has become episodic rather than structural. Once reassurance fades, diversification becomes rational, not rebellious. This also reshapes how crises will be handled in the future. When the next global shock arrives, whether economic, military, or environmental, coordination will depend less on formal alliances and more on perceived reliability. Who answers the phone first? Who moves without hesitation? Who doesn't attach conditions mid-crisis? That's where credibility shows its real value. And credibility cannot be asserted. It has to be accumulated. This is why moments like this matter more than they appear to. They don't redraw borders. They redraw expectations. And expectations guide behavior long after headlines disappear. So while Trump's comment may fade from public memory, its strategic echo will not. It will live on in risk assessments, diversification strategies, and quiet diplomatic outreach designed to ensure that no single partner ever holds decisive leverage again. That is the long arc of this moment. Not confrontation, not collapse, but the slow normalization of hedging. And once hedging becomes normal, the era of unquestioned alignment is over, replaced by a world where power must constantly be earned, reassured, and reinforced. That's the deeper story behind this headline. Let's now push this analysis into the long game consequences, because geopolitics is ultimately shaped by what governments prepare for, not what they announce. What Trump's statement really accelerates is a shift from relationship-based diplomacy to scenario-based diplomacy. Instead of assuming continuity, allies begin asking, what if access changes? What if pressure increases? What if assurances vanish overnight? Once states begin planning around what if, The international system quietly transforms. For Canada, this means future policy will be designed to function under strain, not just under cooperation. Economic resilience becomes more important than efficiency. Political flexibility becomes more valuable than loyalty optics. Even cultural closeness stops being treated as a guarantee. This doesn't weaken Canada, it professionalizes its strategic posture. From Washington's perspective, this is costly. Even if invisible, the United States doesn't lose power when allies disagree. It loses power when allies stop assuming American stability. Because the real advantage of U.S. leadership has never been coercion, it has been predictability. Predictability allowed allies to plan decades ahead without hedging against Washington itself. That advantage is now under pressure. Trump's rhetoric reframes the United States as transactional rather than structural, and transactional powers are treated differently. They are negotiated with harder, trusted less, hedged against more aggressively. This is not about hostility, it's about rational adaptation, and rational adaptation spreads. Other middle powers are watching Canada closely, not because Canada is dramatic, but because it is cautious. If cautious states begin hedging, it signals a deeper systemic unease. Hedging by cautious actors is always more consequential than defiance by ideological ones. This also changes how China operates. Beijing no longer needs to provoke, it simply needs to remain available. It positions itself as patient, stable, and open-ended, knowing that every moment of Western uncertainty improves its relative attractiveness, even if absolute trust remains low. China doesn't need partners to trust it fully. It only needs them to trust it more than unpredictability. That's the strategic environment Trump's comment feeds into. And here's the critical point many miss. Once hedging infrastructure exists, it doesn't disappear when rhetoric softens. Diversification is sticky. Insurance policies are rarely canceled just because the weather improves. So while future U.S. leaders may reassure allies, they will be doing so in a system already adjusted for doubt. Reassurance will have to compete with redundancy, and redundancy always wins in risk management. This is how power transitions actually unfold in the modern world. Not through dramatic breaks, not through formal exits, but through layered preparation for uncertainty. The headline may say this was about Canada and China, but the strategic reality is broader. That is the deeper continuation of this moment, not noise, not ego, but structural adjustment. And this is where the story truly settles, not with a prediction, but with a warning. Geopolitics doesn't turn on speeches or slogans. It turns on expectations. When expectations of stability weaken, states don't protest. They prepare. They don't announce distance. They create options. And by the time those options are visible, the balance has already shifted. Trump's remark about not needing Canada may fade from headlines, but its strategic effect will linger, embedded in planning documents, diversification strategies, and quiet diplomatic choices that never make the news. Because in the modern world, power is no longer about who can stand alone the loudest. It's about who makes others feel safe enough not to. Alliances survive not on dominance, but on confidence. Influence lasts not through pressure, but through reliability. And the moment partners stop assuming permanence, leadership becomes something that must be constantly earned, not declared. That is the real lesson behind this moment. Not about Canada, not about China, but about how words, once spoken by those at the center of power, set long processes in motion, processes that don't reverse easily. This is how geopolitics changes direction, quietly, rationally, irreversibly. You've been watching the Strategic Geopolitics Brief, where we track the shifts beneath the headlines and the signals that shape the world before anyone admits it has changed.